This is the Make Planning Make Sense podcast. I'm your host, Aaron Zimmerman, and I'm a director at Centro. Our guest for this episode is planning barrister Melissa Murphy, KC, of Landmark Chambers. Melissa talks us through the draft NPPF from a fresh perspective, puts the power of planning committees in perspective as well, and considers the limitations of the metaphor of the planning balance. Just to note as well, International Women's Day is coming up on the 8th of March. The day commemorates women's continuing fight for equality and liberation and the proud history of the women's rights movement. Let's give the women in our lives the fist bump, windmill high five, respect, appreciation, and solidarity they deserve. Please give the podcast a follow on your preferred platform, recommend the show to your network, and continue the conversation on our media channels, NPPF Podcast on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky. Here is our conversation with Melissa Murphy, KC. Melissa Murphy, KC of Landmark Chambers, thank you so much for joining us today.
It's a real pleasure to be here. And for those who don't know, here is a planning consultancy office building in the very heart of Clerkenwell. It's very hip, it's a light, beautiful space, and it's a beautiful sunny afternoon.
We always like to start off a little bit with who you are and how you came to your role.
Well, my name is Melissa Murphy. I'm a silk at Landmark Chambers. I moved to Landmark Chambers a couple of years ago from Francis Taylor Building in order to specialise in sort of commercial planning, developer-led planning, because that's my real area of interest. By, I think, aptitude, interest and good fortune, I've ended up doing quite a lot of heritage work, including in London. And so that's a real area of enthusiasm for me. And that is a clue to what I think of as my character. I'm an enthusiast. I've got lots of childish enthusiasms in my personal life. I've got lots of hobbies, football and karaoke, and I let some of my hobbies seep into my professional life. So, for example, I'm very interested in poetry. I really enjoy it. And I put it on LinkedIn.
I've heard that, actually.
Yeah.
I'm bad at seeking things out on LinkedIn, but I have heard that.
I like it. And the people that notice it and who follow and respond to it then are quite like-minded. So it creates quite a virtuous circle in my professional life. So I'm interested in poetry. I'm interested in planning. And I think that's what brings me here and to you.
Well, we're so pleased to have you. And I love the heritage bit. You and I have been in a hearing room together.
Right.
Not on the same team in that particular hearing. But from that moment on, I was just low-key dying to have you on the podcast. So it's really exciting.
Well,
welcome.
That's very flattering. It was a very colourful and interesting hearing. And actually, it marks the second of my yellow set in Monopoly. I've got Leicester Square because I've done a case there. I've got Piccadilly because I've done a case there. So I think I'm just waiting for Coventry Street now. So if there are those listening who have got any schemes on Coventry Street, you know where to come and I can complete my yellow set.
So we are not talking hearings today, unfortunately. We are talking the NPPF, the draft that was published just before Christmas. So listener, before you turn this off thinking, oh, I've already heard a podcast episode talking about the draft NPPF, stay tuned because we're going to take a slightly different approach in breaking down what the draft NPPF implications might be. And it actually starts with the NPPF origin story. It would be my understanding the NPPF is intended to bring order to the practice of planning. It's sort of like a security patch update for an operating system. It's not in statute. It came about when there was a sense that national policy making was a bit unclear. It was a bit too wordy. It was a bit much. And then it was consolidated and clarified into this single document that's meant to maybe provide an operational nudge to how planning had been going up until that point. Is that a fair characterization?
I love the way that you're describing it, and it certainly brings a logic to it. I think the 2012 version of the framework was not about tackling disorder necessarily, but really about a concern relating to prolixity. Just the sheer volume of material that was available up to that point made it really unwieldy for people to deal with. In a sense, there's nothing new about having a national policy governing aspects of development management or plan making. That's not novel at all, but it was dispersed into so many different documents and locations that it was felt that too was unwieldy. So you've got this fragmented, dispersed arrangement. And so the theoretical, if you like, underpinning of the form of the framework in 2012 was to rationalise national policy so that you had something which was much more concise and was much more coherent. Do you remember that they were saying they were going to produce national policy into 50 pages? And I think they just about managed that.
Yeah.
But of course, what then happened is that we missed our old friends, the bits and pieces of guidance. We needed them. And so along came the National Planning and Policy Guidance. It was very much understood to have a sort of subordinate status. But whether that was legally correct or not, do you remember in the Mead case, Mead realisations, and the court then focused on the precise legal status of the PPG and both material considerations, legally speaking, both statements of government policy, and so no legal difference. But there's something of a rebellion in the hearts of many planners because when the PPG was published, it was understood to be very much subordinate to national policy. And of course, it's not produced in the same way. It's not the subject of extensive consultation as we're seeing at the moment with the draft framework. It's interesting to notice that the consultation draft published just before Christmas in 25 really seeks to put, I think, the PPG, the guidance, back into its proper context as subordinate. So that would be something that I would notice just about that origin and that story, that I think we're just going back to where I think the PPG was originally intended to be.
Is that perceived sort of restoration of a hierarchy between the NPPF and the PPG coming from the introduction of development management policies more clearly in the new draft?
Yes, I think you're right. I think that's linked. The intention is to have a single coherent source of material and anything else to be subordinate to that. Yeah.
If you heard me typing, I was looking up the definition of prolixity. So.
Whoops, sorry. It starts right here.
No. I love it. We were talking about sortition in the pre-call.
Well, now that you're going to have to define for us.
It's the practice of organizing democratic decision-making through basically jury selection.
Love it.
So we've described the NPPF as responding to an administrative correction.
Correct. Well, yes, we've focused on form. First of all, haven't we? We've focused on what was the actual form intended to be and to do, and why was it produced in that form. I suppose it rather then begs the question, well, what about the substance of it? What's it actually driving at?
The intentions for plan making and decision taking.
What's planning for? What's it for? And I think that this version of the framework is no different from its predecessor and the more fragmented national policy before that. It's really focused on reconciling competing demands on land, because what you're dealing with is a situation where things are required in the public interest and they have a land use requirement, and that land is not within public control. So essentially it's a regulatory system, isn't it, for reconciling those competing demands. And because it's a political process, the reconciliation of those competing demands is highly politicised. It's why planning is so political. And when it is done best, when those demands, which are often in opposition to one another, when those demands are reconciled best, you can achieve the best of both worlds. And I think that what you're seeing in the framework is another attempt to try to achieve the best of both worlds. And take the example of large-scale schemes, large-scale developments. Mm-hmm. It is thought that you can get maximum delivery with minimum objection, so the maximum public acceptance, where you have large-scale schemes, sometimes which are on greenfield land, well related to, but away from existing settlements, or in and around stations. So what you're trying to do is get maximum public acceptance, maximum delivery of development. If that can be achieved, you get the best of both worlds, but inevitably there are tensions in the system.
And of course, even in the greenfield context, it's not a vacuum. There's going to be competition, even in the context of the collection of consultees. And all of this necessarily finds itself present in the decision-making process. So we have 30, 40 material considerations for an application, let's say. Some will involve trade-offs in a zero-sum balance, and some are going to be about just best possible kind of optimization, just reach as far as you can, right? Like physical fitness test, touch as far as you can past your toes. And then you have the subjective things, the sort of gut feeling things. And last, but certainly not least, are the technical things. You've either done it or you've not. Is the NPPF grappling with these kinds of issues different, these different sort of ways that we might be able to categorize policy based on how many worlds it overlaps?
Well, that's a really complex but an interesting question. I mean, I think that that's okay, but the focus of it is the fact that you've got a discretionary system, you have an inherent balance, obviously, because of the statutory framework. It's a broad balance. It's in accordance with the plan unless material considerations indicate otherwise. And so it's fundamental to the planning decision, that notion of balance. I have to confess, I think this metaphor has got a bit out of hand. And I'll explain why I think that is. In the framework, you do see, I think, a creeping or even an overt centralisation in terms of it moving towards more rules-based, and the rules are set by governments. You've got the centralisation, I think. And it extends so far as to seek to prescribe the weight that a decision maker should attribute to something in a metaphorical planning balance. So, for example, that substantial weight is to be attributed to this factor or that factor. And I am a little concerned, actually, at the impression that's given of a quasi-mathematical exercise when planning is no such thing, actually. Think about it in this way. One sort of harm, for example, a heritage harm, might be something to do with undermining the historic significance of a heritage asset. So it might be about, I don't know, cutting across something which is architecturally significant.
Yeah.
Now, in your quasi-mathematical balance, you say, what's that, a 7 out of 10? Is it on a harm scale? But, I'm creating a new path up to the heritage asset, and so I give myself a plus, 7 in the planning balance. And so what I'm doing is I'm treating things which are unalike as equivalent because I'm treating it as if it's a mathematical exercise. I have to say, I don't think that's how decisions are really made.
No.
I think that the way that humans make decisions is that they are single decisions. Ultimately, they're yes or no decisions, red or black decisions, but they're multifaceted.
Yeah.
And what we do is we hold in mind the factors which we feel to be important. We take all of those things into account and we feel them to be important. That's what we're trying to get to with this overworked metaphor about weight. But I think that in prescribing particular sorts of weight, we're going too far down that path of a quasi-mathematical analysis. And my sense is that it is oversimplifying what is actually quite a complex, multifaceted decision-making process. We should just acknowledge the complexity of it.
Yeah, I've grappled with this exact same thing in appeals, in writing my own planning statements, whatever it might be, because of course it's not mathematical. But of course, you still want to go through every single thing because if it accords with the development plan, then you should get at least some positive way because it's sustainable future development. But then if you actually put that in a table, then you get scolded because it's not mathematical, which I know. It's just one of those things where I think the word balance is just, inadequate. And you have words like great weight or substantial weight, but that also doesn't create any kind of accountability in the decision making as to whether that great weight is more or less than the other great weight. It's really all over the place.
I've criticised it for being overly simplistic or overly simplifying complex issues, but if one thinks about what the underlying objective is here, it's to make the grant of planning permission that bit more likely. So there is method in it in saying that substantial weight should be attributed to this benefit or that benefit. I think it is intentionally seeking to neutralise harms within the planning balance, and that is a sort of quasi-mathematical exercise which seems to be intended.
Yeah.
But I think it is interesting to interrogate that and to just remind oneself of the fact that this is only actually a metaphor.
Could you talk a little bit more about this trend towards centralisation that you're seeing in the current draft?
It's best illustrated, I think, by reference to the suite of development management policies that we've got now in the draft framework. The choice made is not to have a statutory basis for them, but it's nonetheless a welcome, I think, rationalisation, because rather than have policies which are a little bit different in each local plan and then an argument about the local circumstances and examination, I think moving into a more standardised system is helpful. That process has been a relatively slow one to get to this point, but looking at the draft framework and what it says about implementation, that is a day one change. And what you'll see from the annex to the framework is that on day one that it is published in its final form, policies which are inconsistent with the framework be given limited weight. And that's just worth pausing and reflecting on. So it means that draft plans which are in production now, if published and adopted prior to that publication date, will their policies, to the extent that are inconsistent with the framework, will have limited weight. That's quite a change.
It's sort of like just swapping them out, though, in decision making, isn't it? It's quite a change, and I don't think it's been done before now. But
you're right. That's exactly what you'll do. You'll substitute one for the other.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it's a really powerful step for the draft to be taking. And we don't need to spend a lot of time on this, but of course there's the sort of legal complexity of it still not being a statutory document, but claiming a type of primacy over the statutory development plan.
Yeah, I think I'm with those who would say that there is clearly a legal distinction, but I would query the practical difference. Take heritage as a really good example. What the framework has said about heritage policy in decisions inevitably goes, irrespective of the minute or even more substantive differences in local policy. So I think actually it is reflecting what the framework is saying in Annex A implementation is reflecting a practical reality for decision makers in any event. Yeah.
That gives me hope. So what happens with these local plans that are currently going through examination is one question. I'm really excited, though, to see the first draft local plan to be submitted for examination after the new NPPF is adopted.
We've got such a complex system at the moment. I produced a set of slides for a conference in Cambridge, which we did recently, and I had to face up to the fact that we've got actually 3 different systems, 3 different modes for analysis of local plans at the moment. So if you did your Reg 19 plan pre-12th of March 2025, you're a 2023 plan, and subject to those criteria about sufficiency of housing and so on. Between the 12th of March 2025 and 31st of December 2026, you're in inverted commas legacy plan, so you're examined under the 2024 framework. And then we're going to have a third set of plans under the new arrangement. So if you're a post 31st of December 2026 plan, you are going to be subject to the NPPF 2026. So it is actually quite a complex system. To the uninitiated, that's absolutely baffling.
Yeah.
And even for those of us who understand that there's a rationale, actually, I think there is something slightly odd about the fact that you are examining documents which are directed to the same objectives, but you're assessing them against different tests. I just find there's something slightly odd about that. And like you, I think I'm looking ahead to the plans which are then made under the new system. And you're absolutely right. There is scope for these to be much more pamphletty in nature. Because if you think about it, as you obviously have been doing, you have a suite of development management policies at national level, which you're not to repeat. In time, you'll have a spatial development strategy. We know Section 12D is not yet enforced, but it will be soon. And so that is specifying the basic content of it, setting the expectations for it. And now in the draft framework, we know what SDSs are going to be including. They're going to be looking over a 20-year time horizon. They're going to include development requirements, essentially the disposition of development as between local authority areas and identifying broad locations for growth. So we've got all of that. So if development management policies are happening at national level, the SDS is then setting development requirements for broad locations for growth. Really then, when you look at the role and function of a local plan, you can see, well, at first you can see that the standardization in terms of the 10 kind of measurable objectives, and then its allocations. And this is why I say, well, does that turn into a kind of a pamphlet with then a suite of allocation policies, really something very visual, a real visual document? You know, why would it be more than that?
The term visual document piques my interest because there's a similar sort of visual document theme to the design guide concept, where you give some rules, some expectations. If you meet those rules, you've got creativity around the rest of the design. But give me brick, give me whatever it is, 20 centimeter window reveals, blah, blah, blah. But then I've seen draft design guides and they're just like really long SPGs, basically. So it's all about how you do it. And that is true in plan making, it's true in decision taking, it's true in design guides. But I want to make sure that we're really emphasizing this point that you're making about how the scope of a local plan is getting whittled from 2 directions. Maybe for the season finale, I'll make a pamphlet local plan.
I'd love to see that.
Just best practices.
I think probably the next good topic in looking at the draft framework is to just work through the big ticket items within it, which are of really significant interest to the industry, to our markets, to our clients. And I think those include green and grey belt, heritage, flood risk and viability. So those I think are the proper subject for our analysis, Aaron.
So green and grey belt, very familiar with that. We've had it for a year.
Yeah.
Any headline changes that you see in that category there?
Well, I think when we started talking about the draft framework, one of the things we were asking ourselves is to what extent is this more rules-based? And I think here's an example of where there has been, I think, attempts to ensure that policy is more rules-based. And GB7, for example, certainly looks at it setting out, isn't it, circumstances in which development will not be inappropriate in the green belt. But when you get into all of this, you see the scope for planning judgment retained. And so we get back to where we were in the guidance, which is to look to see, well, is something making a strong contribution to this purpose or that purpose? We get back into looking at essentially the difference between a strong and moderate contribution. And so you still have there a need for a judgment to be taken. And as soon as you've got a need for planning judgment to be taken, you can't have certainty. You can have a view about what's more likely, but you can't be certain. And that then obviously brings investment risk. And so what I think you've got there and it's not the only example, we can look at others, but something that looks more rules-based and is clearly more standardised, but it retains judgment. And I suppose while that's necessary, it does then, of course, reduce certainty.
One of your colleagues at Landmark Chambers, Ruben, who we had on the podcast
Lovely
earlier.
Ruben.
Love a Ruben,
Yeah.
absolutely. We didn't get to talk about it in his episode, actually, but he talked about the two different levels of planning.
Yeah.
There's the local decision-taking, and then there's the sort of inspectorate and above decision-taking. They're performing the same statutory tests, and they have the same decision-making documents, but they operate differently. And I'd love your thoughts on how that might apply to the green and grey belt policies, heritage, etc.
Well, there are things that I'd like to say about this. And the first is that I think there's such a myth, isn't there, on which our system is based. And that is that there's a local democracy, that there's accountability in a democratic sense in relation to decision-taking. The reality is that there's only a democratic accountability if the answer to the question, can I have planning permission, is yes. Because if the answer to the question, can I have planning permission, is no, then you can go to an appeal. And then you have an appeal inspector or the Secretary of State. And the appeal inspector in particular, that level, so there's a subject to call him, but your appeal inspector is a professional with no democratic mandate, taking an independent decision. Now, taking the independent decision in the public interest, yes, but democratically accountable, no. So in circumstances in which your local decision is no, you then lose that layer of democratic accountability. So one wonders, if it is only in certain circumstances that there's democratic accountability, why do we have it at all? I would query that. And going into then the point that you are making, I think that underlying what you're saying is a sense that there's an inherent conservatism at local level. In some areas, it's more acute than others, but that there is a resistance to change. Whereas at that independent appeal inspector level, the approach, the same tests, the same professional judgment, same planning judgments are reached in a more neutral way. That seems to be the implication of what you're saying. And I'm sure that there are areas in which that is true. And I'm sure that there are areas in which actually a more neutral planning balance is reached.
Yeah. No, that's one of the implications of it.
Yeah.
The degree of objectivity is greater the higher you go in that sort of process.
Are you contending that for the Secretary of State too?
If you'd like to be on the podcast.
That was provocative of me.
Oh, no, I felt it. I was like, ooh, it's the cross-examination energy.
We're laughing, but there's an awkwardness to it.
My palms are sweaty, yeah. But it's another thing that, it draws contrast between sort of a technocratic approach at the higher level and the maybe more visceral local approach at the lower level. But whether it's at the local or at the inspectorate or at the ministerial level, the planning system as it's designed, if it's to work properly, it's predicated on the decision maker essentially being like a philosopher king, right? Plato's ideal form of government, except it can't work. Because it goes back to your original point. It's not a balance.
Okay, but Aaron, you're rebelling against imperfection. I'd put this to you. Which would you prefer? The imperfection of the fact that we're not all philosopher kings, or a decision made by AI? Because, chances are that'll be an option.
Oh, no. I think that's a false dichotomy. I don't think, please don't let them be decided by AI.
But that's a much more, if you're looking for complete neutrality, it's not really human judgment you're after, is it?
No, I'm not after complete neutrality. I'm coming at it with this sort of thought in mind about how unsupported local decision makers are in balancing and prioritizing everyone else's number one priority. And I think that is a challenge for them. And it's also to the detriment of delivery and productivity and effective decision making at that local level. I'm definitely not going around with like my Dettol wipes being like, that's imperfect, what the hell? It's really a question to me about making sure that the decision maker has the clarity and all of the information available to them, how to go about making that decision without necessarily having to be a really seasoned practitioner. And I think that in the absence of that, coda, there is a tendency toward small c conservatism in decision making, because the do-nothing scenario becomes a bit more comfortable.
I see. Well, I think that can be one reason for suboptimal decision-making. And I think in an under-resourced system, that's a particular risk. But I think that is not the only, or even possibly the most powerful reason for conservatism underlying local decision-making. I think it is actually, in truth, that local politics is influential. And local politics very often, not exclusively, but very often is anti-development. And I think that exerts a considerable pressure at local level.
We will be right back.
I see the heritage chapter as being something of a curate's egg. There have been some changes. There's certainly changes to the ordering and formulation of it, although we see much of the same language. HE6 is I think, key development management policy within that. And you can see at the beginning reference to the statutory regard. And I think whether the subsequent paragraphs are effective in giving proper weight to that, I think rather depends on whether they are read in that context and decision makers are good about doing that. I was a little bit surprised to see changes made to the heritage paragraphs within the framework, because they'd received particular attention in cases. And we'd had a judgment of the Court of Appeal. Lord Justice Sales used this really memorable expression. He referred to the fasciculus of paragraphs in the framework. Do you remember that?
The fasciculus.
Have I mispronounced it? I've always called it fasciculus.
I'm just literally parroting Laurie Hancock, who said it on the podcast as well. Yeah. And then I was like sounding it out.
I love the expression. It means a kind of bundle of nerves. I love how visual that is.
Yeah.
And I was surprised to see changes made to that sequence of paragraphs, because they were quite reassuring for decision makers. You could say to them, well, provided you work through these paragraphs in sequence, you will, per Jones and Mordew, be giving effect to the statutory regard.
Yes.
So I think we lose that.
We'll get to rehash all of it in the courts again.
Yeah, well, job's for us.
That'll be a job for you, unfortunately. And I'll happily defer. Let's talk flood risk. I've always been fascinated by it because a substantial area in London is in flood zones 3A and 3B, asterisk, benefiting from river defence. We know that the Thames barrier is going to be no longer fit for purpose in 2020. And we also have vast existing settlements up and down the country in these kinds of flood zones. How do we reconcile urban renewal and the importance of these places as grown over millennia with the flood risk?
Well, the first point is that we need to respect the constraint. We need to understand it, and we need to respect it, because there's no doubt in my mind that it's a serious practical issue, isn't it, that we're grappling with, and it's not going to get any easier to deal with. And actually, it is quite difficult to talk about flood risk without sounding like you're failing to take that issue seriously. But we must talk about it, because actually I think national policy and guidance had got us into really quite a difficult place for site promotion, where sequential testing seemed to be needed when really it wasn't. And I think there's a laudable objective both here and in the context of viability, that really you would have the bulk of the work done at plan making stage. But of course, there's the lack of realism in that when the majority of the plans in this country are not up to date. So of course, in order to get development actually delivered, you're going to have to be looking at individual site promotion. So once one accepts that, then you're looking at whether or not sequential testing is needed in order to promote a site for development and in order to get your planning permission. And we had got to a point at which, if there was surface water on a site, that was going to require sequential testing. Now, that has been resolved, I think, well, actually already really by changes to guidance, but we see that now settled in the framework. So I see that as practical, helpful. I think we've now got to a reasonable place, and actually probably where we were before the substation action case, I think it had arrived at a pretty sensible reconciliation of all this, and I think we've got right back to that. I think in viability, we're probably not quite there in terms of the necessary pragmatism. And that's because there still seems to be this, to me, rather weak insistence that the primary arena for debates about viability should be at plan making stage. Just to me, that is just
Boo, everybody.
Why would that be the case? It's the exercise at plan making stage is necessarily crude. It's necessarily high level. To me, it makes no sense to have as your initial battle at the development management stage that you must get into a world in which you're looking at viability appraisal anyway. And I think actually it's one of those arguments that one has in planning where it's more honoured in the breach than anything else. We pay lip service to the idea that we haven't decided that we're going to take this into account, and then suddenly here we are taking all of this into account. So I think that's a rather pointless exercise.
Yeah, I think so. And then you have this sort of resentment and this almost sort of combative, visceral exercise over a technical question where the planning officer is assuming, well, this was an adopted plan. Why aren't you meeting our expectation? And the developer saying, yeah, it's not going to happen. It can't.
Readily, I'd concede that I think plans need to be realistic. And you'll have seen in the framework that when you're examining a local plan, that's one of the tests, that it had to be realistic. Yeah. So I completely accept that there needs to be realism. So there does need to be some testing at viability plan stage. But I think what I think we need to lose is the pretense that that obviates the need where an applicant seeks to insist on it for viability testing at development management stage. Simple as that.
Yeah, which is akin to saying, let's take the way that it just happens now, its reality, and remove the bitter flavour from it.
Yeah, just formalise that. Just accept it. Yeah. And I don't see why, because that's what happens in practice anyway.
Just aligning expectations. Really.
That's it.
And we'll see in due course how the actual final wording of all of these looks. But if the NPPF draft were adopted as it's currently written, what do you see the effects of that being?
Well, I think the combination of statutory reform and the framework will radically change plan making. I think the introduction of much more logical layers of plan making, I think for anybody who wants to see a more efficient system is going to welcome that. That spatial layer is just so obviously useful in order to make proper infrastructure provision and in order to settle development requirements at a local level. So you're taking some of the rows out of the local plan examination process, which I think is an incredibly helpful thing. So I think where there is legitimate concern is whether we will end up back where we were in 2010 when the coalition government saw fit to get rid of the regional spatial strategies on the basis that they were imposing top-down targets which weren't then accepted at a local level. I wouldn't like to see us go back to that because I think this is a more logical way of running our plan-making system.
I think that there's a lot of time and sort of grief in the practice of planning about things like the minimum targets. And you go through all of the rehearsals in every planning statement and appeal statement of case. But when you look at actual delivery figures, or even, and it's not all the council's responsibility to deliver, but if you look at just the number of homes approved relative to objectively assessed need and then adjusted minimum requirement, for some authorities, they've just never aligned and they never will. So how much longer are we taking that seriously?
it may be worth disentangling some of the issues here. I think the framework, this version of the framework, to my mind, creates the most liberal policy regime that there's been since I've been in practice, which is since 2001. It creates probably the best conditions for getting planning permission that I can ever remember. So yes, I'm sure you could go even further in national policy, but that is going pretty far towards facilitating, if you like, the grant of planning permission. That is not to say it resolves all that is happening, all the reasons why development is not delivered in this country.
Oh, God, no.
It's the sort of equivalent of taking my cold stroke flu and just continually dosing me with Lemsip, but not actually stopping work so that I can recover, just to take a random example.
I'm going to have to think about the analogy, but no Lemsip is present in our office.
Because my point being that the macroeconomic position is such that it's little wonder that development is not delivered even when planning permission is granted, bearing in mind construction costs, bearing in mind cost of borrowing, bearing in mind all of the aspects of a viability appraisal and the burdens that are placed on development. So it is not the case that you can amend planning policy so as to make it easier to get planning permission granted and then automatically see development delivered. It just doesn't work like that.
No,
There isn't a tweak to planning policy which waves a magic wand and resolves that.
It's always everything, right? To the extent that I would have written the draft NPPF differently, I agree with and share your view that in the world of iterative, incremental policymaking, and that's how things are done, this is a good step in the right direction.
Well, it rather depends on your perspective, Aaron. I mean, there are definitely people who are concerned about the loss of the footnote 7 carve-out in terms of that presumption in favour of sustainable development, because that...
Is that the areas and assets of particular importance?
Yes, so for example, heritage would be one of them, actually.
I loved that carve-out being removed.
But the point is that it depends on perspective. And so that would be seen as removing a layer of protection. Similarly, the nature conservation chapter, I think there will be those who will regard that as retrograde because it is reducing the protection to, for example, valued landscapes, they will say. So as ever, one's perspective will dictate how you view these things. But I think looked at in the round, it's clear that the national policy, this version, if published in this form, or a form very like it, will make it considerably easier for planning permission to be granted for many forms of development.
Yeah. I think for anything that would be just particularly brazenly, obviously harmful, the decision makers' hands are no less tied or no more tied.
Well, we'll see.
By the current draft. Because they still have the development plan.
Well, why shouldn't they be? Why shouldn't we protect the things we value?
Well, of course we should protect the things we value. Yeah, no, that's all good, right? We're not like deleting conservation area layers off the map, but it's a matter of degree because I have my own perspective on the frequency of good schemes that can't happen currently. But to the extent that anybody who is resistant...
Well, Aaron, are they near a station? Because I think...
Should we talk about this?
I think you'd probably view them in a slightly more optimistic way now.
Yeah, no. Some colleagues in consultancies elsewhere have been waving the handkerchief running around saying like, in principle permissions. I was like, that's not what this is going to mean. Yeah. It's just not. But the same is true for AOMBs, for conservation areas, for settings of listed buildings. Removing that carve out, I think, doesn't mean that the decision taker is any less empowered to give the appropriate weight to those considerations in their decision.
Well, it's interesting that you should say that because I often think that planning is very incremental, that it moves incrementally one way or another way. And I would see this as an incremental move in favour of the grant of planning permission.
It is that as well. No, I do take your point. But through that incremental process, we'd still be like, at this pace, we're still like probably 5-10 years away from anybody actually feeling more constrained than they are now in decision taking on these issues. That's my hot take. I don't know. Should we end on a fun one? Let's do a fun one. We've got the draft NPPF. We've got the new London plan coming forward in the next few years. If it were entirely up to you to hold the pen on either of those documents, policy making by decree for a day, what would be the first thing that you'd love to change or add?
I think I would, by instinct, be a contrarian. And I would. My starting point would be, actually, goodness, it's been almost continual change one of the things that I would really like to see is a good system implemented and then allowed to become stable. So actually, of all of the things that we've been talking about, I think there's many really good and sensible changes in all of this. I will help implement whatever it says in my client's best interest. But actually, I think for a functional system, you need some maturity within that system. And I think that's one of the flaws in planning in the course of my career at the bar, is that I've seen constant change. So that's my contrarian view, is I would say, actually, don't change anything. Let it be.
Just copy paste, add the new year next to it. I understand and take your point there.
However, actually, saying that is manifestly inconsistent with the discussion that we've had so far, because I've already said, actually, what I think needs to change. I think we need to get rid of this mealy-mouthed business of saying that viability is for the plan-making stage only, and it shouldn't be It shouldn't be for development management. I think we should just get rid of that. I just don't think that's what happens in practice. And actually, I don't think that the appraisal work at local plan stage is fit for purpose when it comes to specific schemes. And in order to get stuff delivered, it's got to be viable. So we really do need to just grasp that nettle.
Yeah, let's take the outrage out of that part. Well, this has been so fun.
I'd love talking to you.
Likewise. Dream come true. This is my Disneyland moment. Melissa Murphy, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you.
Thank you for joining us for another episode of Make Planning Make Sense. Please do give the show a follow, and please share the show to keep the conversation going and the community growing. Find us on Instagram, X, and Blue Sky at MPMS Podcast, or write to us at podcast@centroplan.co.uk. Make Planning Make Sense is presented by Centro Planning Consultancy and recorded in beautiful London, England. Its executive producer is me, Aaron Zimmerman. Marketing and promotion by our colleague Reese Raymond. Graphic design by our colleague Miriam Malaxi. Music by Joseph McDade. From all of us here at Centro, thanks again for listening.